Next week, we have someone named Neil Kashkari coming who's running for governor and previously ran the TARP program. So an interesting guy, he's first time here. And then 2 weeks from today, final exam. Green and purple Scantron sold only at the ASUC store. Okay? Any questions about that? Last announcement is next semester, fall, Poli-Sci 179 will be back. Yay. And yes, you can take it again and again for credit, so please do. We will have all new speakers. And I'm also teaching law at the business school, BizAd 175. Any of you considering law or want to know about law or need legal help? Okay. It's Tuesday, Thursday, 12:30 to 2, and it's open to everybody. You don't have to be a business major. And I'm teaching business ethics. Okay, thank you. Mondays, 2 to 4. Keep the enthusiasm down just a tad. Nike, calm down, Nike. All right, there you go. Today, I am happy to have back with us. He's been at this class many times over the years. This is Dan Schnur right here. Any of you had Dan's class? Dan teaches a class at the Poli-Sci department for many years now. Have any of you had that? No? Okay. It's a class that I highly recommend. It's pretty small. How do you limit it to?
60.
60?
60.
60 kids. I mean, the line, it's very hard to get into the class, but highly recommend applying. You really learn what campaigns are about. It's the only Poli-Sci class, aside from this one, that deals with something called reality. Dan has tremendous experience running campaigns. He's run campaigns for many years, for all the way up to president, governor, and worked in the Wilson administration. Not Woodrow, for those of you wondering, okay? Pete, the governor of California. And, very interestingly now, he's been also teaching this Poli-Sci class here and at USC for many years. He is now running for office for the first time. He's running as an independent for Secretary of State. Let that sink in. There we go. They're on delay.
Nice prompt.
Yeah, there we go. And what's interesting about Dan's campaign is he's actually running for this office because he cares about it, not just because it's a job and a stepping stone, because all these guys in Sacramento who just don't want to actually leave, and so they just run for office and do musical chairs when they get termed out. Dan ran the FPPC up in Sacramento, which is the Fair Political Practices Commission, recently. You want to applaud for the FPPC? You can do that. And so he's running as an independent because he wants to actually do this job and make a difference. Please welcome Dan Schnur.
Thanks, Alan. And thanks, you guys. As Alan mentioned, I teach a course here at Cal every fall semester, Poli-Sci 106A. And in spring semester, I get homesick. So thank you for letting me come back. I got to make my stop at Cafe Strada. I feel re-energized, and that'll carry me over until school starts again in the fall. I am running for Secretary of State of California, but I'm going to make you a promise before we talk today. I am not here to give a campaign speech. I'm not here to give a campaign speech, and let me make that absolutely clear. If someone in question and answer period wants to ask a question about the campaign, I'm certainly more than happy to answer it. What's that? Oh, www.forschnur.com. If anyone wants to ask any other questions during Q&A, I'm happy to answer them. But I will tell you this at the very outset. My single biggest pet peeve in higher education, at Cal, at SC, at George Washington, at Kennedy School, any of the places I've taught over the years, my single biggest pet peeve are professors who use their classroom as a bully pulpit to forward a partisan agenda from the left or the right, because to me, that shows a fundamental disrespect to you as students. And what I tell my students in Poli-Sci 106A and what I tell my students at SC as well, is I tell them on the first day of class, I said, if you have an ideology, and I hope you do because this is a class in politics, if you have an ideology, I want you to leave it at the door and I will do the same thing. Because I have enough respect for you as 19 and 20 and 21-year-olds not to tell you what to think. My job is to help you look at politics and to understand it better and how it works. That's what I try to do in the classroom. If I were to come in and advocate on behalf of a particular candidate, Republican, Democrat, even me, to me, like I said, that's showing you a fundamental level of disrespect. You've heard the old adage, I guess All adages are old. There's no such thing as a new adage. I guess you've heard the adage, give a man a fish and he'll be hungry again the next day. Teach a man to fish and he'll be able to fish for the rest of his life. I've applied that to academia over my years of teaching. Tell somebody what to think, and they won't know what to think tomorrow. Teach someone how to think, and they'll be able to think for the rest of their lives. So I am running for office, and I'm more than happy, like I said, later to talk about it a little bit, but that's not why I'm here today. Actually, I don't know if that's why you asked me or not, Ellen. I guess it's a little bit too late since I promised not to campaign. Yeah. Good point. So I started teaching here at Cal in 1995. And in 2008, or excuse me, in the early 2000s, I began teaching at USC as well. And in 2008, I got called in to see the dean of the College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences at SC. And he asked me, he said, Dan, would you be interested in running our Institute of Politics? Now, for years, I'd worked on political campaigns, like Alan said. Then I did communications and media consulting for corporate clients, got bored with that pretty quick, and spent a lot of years doing similar consulting for nonprofits and foundations, primarily working on behalf of education reform and political reform. But he came to me and said, would you be interested in not just teaching as an adjunct, like you have been at Cal, like you have been at SC, would you be interested in a full-time job running our Institute of Politics? And I laughed at him. And what I learned is, in case you ever find yourself in this situation, laughing at the dean's a bad idea. And he asked me what was so funny, and I told him. I said, Howard, you know I don't have a doctorate, right? He said, I know. I said, you know I don't have a graduate degree of any kind. He said, yeah, I know. And I said, you know it took me 7 years to get my bachelor's, don't you? He said, well, let's just keep that one between us. So they offered me the job running this Institute of Politics down there. It's like IGS, just warmer. And it's a really great job. My job, my full-time job, at least until I took a leave to run in this campaign, my full-time job is to get our students down there more interested, more involved, and more excited, more motivated to participate in politics, government, and public service. I like to say that I have the third best job at USC, after the president and after the football coach. For those of you who are football fans, you know that last year I had the second best job at USC. But when he offered me the job, I said, there's only one thing that's non-negotiable. I said, I'll negotiate salary, and I should have. I'll negotiate teaching load, the number of classes that I teach. I said, the one thing I won't negotiate is I've been teaching a class at the University of California, Berkeley since 1995, for 14 years now, and obviously more since then. I've been teaching a class at the University of California, Berkeley since 1995, and I'm not going to give that up. That is a deal killer. So every fall semester, I fly up here 1 day a week because I really, really love the University of California, Berkeley. And thank you for giving me just a little bit of a Berkeley high. Well, not literally. to get me through spring semester. So a couple questions for you guys. How many people take Alan Ross's class because you are truly, madly, deeply, intensely interested in politics? That's more than usual. How many people in this room think that they might want to go into politics or government or public service someday? It's more than usual too. Nice job, Ross. How many people are taking this class because it's a really, really easy one credit? Everybody's hand goes up for that, okay. Okay, so it's usually about a one-third, one-third, one-third split. All right. I love politics. I love politics. I could very easily watch West Wing and House of Cards episodes 23 hours a day, then take a break for Mad Men, and then go back to Bartlett and Underwood. And that would be a good day for me. Yeah, so I'm not particularly normal. We'll get to that later. So I love politics. I eat it, I drink it, I sleep it. I love it. But I'm frustrated by it. I'm angry about it. Because politics is broken. Politics is broken in California. Politics is broken in Washington. And when the students from Common Cause came up here, and by the way, I'd encourage you to go to their event next week. I tried to change my campaign schedule so I could be on that panel. I just wasn't able to pull it off. But I'm a former board member of Common Cause. There is too much money in politics, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But politics is broken. Politics is broken. And I think there are three things about politics in particular that are broken that I want to talk to you about today. Talk to you not only about why they're broken, but how you can fix them. Number one, politics is broken because there is way too much money in politics. How many people in this room have their own super PAC? One, plus Alan, that's two. Okay. How many people in this room have their own lobbyist? How many people in this room have given more than $1 million to an independent expenditure committee for either a Democratic or Republican candidate over the last election cycle? Yeah, I get different answers on that at Stanford, but okay. And what that means for too many people in politics is that you guys don't count. Because each of you gets one vote. Each of you gets one vote, and I hope you plan to use it, whether it's for me or somebody else this June or this November. Crying out loud, just vote, at the very least. But for most people in politics, that doesn't count. Because you get one single vote, you get one single vote, you get one single vote. But the Koch brothers, George Soros, Sheldon Adelson, Tom Steyer, many of you know who those names are, some of you may not. These are very wealthy individuals who abide by the law. They don't do anything wrong in the eyes of the law. But every year they give millions and millions and millions of dollars to the candidates and causes that are important to them. And what that means is you get one vote and they get millions of votes. So when a politician has to get reelected, who are they going to talk to? The person who gets one vote or the person who gets a million? There's too much money in politics. Now, I'm not a lawyer. In some places that's an applause line, but obviously not in Apollo's high class. I'm not a lawyer, which means that the likelihood of me being named to the US Supreme Court is a pretty slim one. But what I'll tell you is the United States Supreme Court over the years has made a series of decisions long before McCutcheon and long before Citizens United, and if you don't know what those are, look them up because Alan's going to ask you about them on the final, right, Alan? Okay. Going all the way, McCutcheon, M-C-C-U-T-C-H-E-O-N, Citizens United, you can spell that. But the US Supreme Court decided many, many years ago, back in the 1970s, that when it came to political expression, that money was the equivalent of speech. And what they meant by that is that they said, we cannot legally constrain your ability to spend money on behalf of candidates or causes that you believe in any more than we can constrain your right to free speech. So let me tell you what's wrong with that. Let me tell you what's wrong with that. I have a right to free speech. I can stand in Sproul Plaza and talk about an issue that's important to me. I'm exercising my First Amendment rights. But what if, where's Nick? Nick's not here? Okay, I thought he was coming today. Where's Bridget? Okay, there's my friend Bridget. Bridget took my class last fall. Tell them nice things about it, okay? Lie if you have to. Good. Let's say Bridget's in Sproul Plaza talking about something that's important to her. And I pull up next to her in a sound truck. And I download huge speakers on both sides of her. And I turn the volume up to 11. And I drown out every word, every syllable that she's trying to say. Well, then I'm not just exercising my First Amendment rights. I'm interfering with hers. And the functional equivalent of that is what happens every day of every week of every election year when very wealthy individuals, corporations, and unions spend millions of dollars drowning out your votes. So what can you do about that? Well, over the long haul, there are things you can do to rein in the amount of spending that can be done in elections. In the short run, though, I'll give you an idea, something that we can do here in California and something I've been working to do. What I believe we can do, if we can't in the immediate restrain the amount of money spent on a campaign, what we can do at the very least is to weaken the link, to break the link between political giving and government action. So even if you give money to candidates of your choice, there's not a quid pro quo where your check ends up being a down payment for a vote on a piece of legislation that's important to you or to your interest. So what I've proposed is a ban on all fundraising at any time that the California State Legislature is in session. Now, it doesn't interfere with anyone's First Amendment rights that the Supreme Court has outlined. You can still give just as much money to candidates now under those rules as you can now. But if you can't give money to candidates, if you can't give money to elected officials while the session's going on, well, then you create some separation between your political contribution on one hand and government action on the other. Because let me tell you how it works now, both in Sacramento and in Washington, D.C. When the legislature's in session, when Congress is in session, every breakfast, every lunch, every dinner is a fundraising opportunity. And so what you see, it's incredible. You see, it's like a relay race. Legislators of both parties sprint off the floor of the Capitol, across L Street in downtown Sacramento, to one of the nearby bars or restaurants, pick up a stack of special interest donations, and rush back across the street to the Capitol to vote on those special interest bills before the ink on the checks is even dry. And I think that's wrong. I know that fundraising is a necessary part of politics, but governing is a necessary part of politics too. And you shouldn't be able to do both at the same time. I don't think we can get money out of politics, like my friends from Common Cause said, but you can apply some restraints, and you can create some separation so that politicians aren't taking money from a special interest on one hand and voting on their bills on the other. Another thing that's wrong with politics is there's not enough people involved. There's not enough people involved. And what I mean in particular is there's not enough people voting, particularly among the youngest Californians and the newest Californians. So I've been talking to students here and talking to students at SC for a lot of years, and I've been studying and reading about you guys and your habits. And here's what I know about the millennial generation. The millennial generation votes in smaller numbers than any other generation in America today or in recent American history. And so let me tell you what old people think about you guys when they see a statistic like that. You know what old people think when they hear that? They think you guys don't care, that you're too self-involved. Millennials, give them an iPad and their Kardashians and they'll be happy. And I know that's not true. I know it's more complicated than that. Because I know the millennial generation, I know your generation, even if you vote in smaller numbers than the rest of us, millennials volunteer their time back into their community in greater amounts than any other generation today or in recent American history. So why is that? Why would an entire generation, why would your generation, devote hours and hours and hours every week to cleaning up parks, to running community cleanups or neighborhood watch programs, teaching an at-risk child to read, bringing a meal to a senior? Why would the young person devote hours and hours every week to volunteering on behalf of a cause that's important to them and not take 15 minutes every 2 years to vote? Well, I have a few theories on that. One, like I said earlier, most of you don't have your own super PAC, you don't have your own lobbyists, you don't make million-dollar contributions. And many, the most publicly and civically minded members of your generation, many of them, have decided that they'd rather volunteer and make a difference that they can see than participate in a political process where their voice is drowned out by the louder and wealthier voices. And one of the things I try to get across to my students here and at SC both is I try to tell you guys, I said, look, volunteering is admirable. Volunteering is noble. But you know what? You can only clean up so many parks. And if you really want to make a difference, not instead of volunteering, but when you're done cleaning up the park, then go volunteer for a candidate or go vote for a candidate who's going to clean up a lot more parks through legislation than you ever could with your own two hands. So why is it? Why is it that such an intelligent and well-informed and well-educated generation still rejects voting? And I've got an idea, and I want to hear you guys' thoughts on it. I'll wrap up in just a minute so I can hear your thoughts. I think it comes down to what we teach you when you're even younger, or more accurately, what we don't teach you. How many people here went to high school in California? A few. How many people here were required to volunteer a certain number of hours in order to get a high school diploma? Almost all of you. Most California public high schools require a certain number of hours of volunteering in order to get a diploma. Mandatory volunteerism. It's my second favorite oxymoron. Jumbo shrimp is the other, okay. But all jokes aside, what I've seen in my years of teaching and getting to know my students, not just while they're here at Cal or while they're at SC, but staying in touch with them afterwards, is that even if you're required to volunteer when you're 14 or 15 or 16 years old, you learn some lessons from that volunteering. Maybe not all of you, but many of you. You learn about the importance of giving back to your community. You learn about the importance of being part of a cause greater than your own self-interest. you learn that it feels good to hang out with other people who care about the same thing you do to make a difference in some way or other. And when you go to college, even though it's not required anymore, you keep volunteering. And what I'll predict for many of you is when you're out of college in your 20s, you'll keep volunteering. And what I'll predict for many of you when you're 30s and you've got homes and families of your own, you're going to keep volunteering because you learned those lessons when you were young. And statistics bear this out. Your generation volunteers not just in high school, but in college and post-college in greater numbers than any other generation, mine or even Alan's included. On the flip side, most California public schools, as I think you guys know, require one single semester of civics before you graduate. 14 weeks of civics and geography and American government all crammed together into one crash course that usually gets offered in 11th or 12th grade. And I've come to believe that the message that we send to your generation, inadvertently, but we send it anyway, the message that we send to you guys is this politics stuff, this government stuff, this democracy stuff is so unimportant that we're not going to bother teaching it to you for your first 10 years of school. But, oh, by the way, a year from now, we want you to turn around and be responsible citizens and voters. And I don't think that's fair. Most of you are going to vote. Most of you already do. Most of you are going to continue to vote. Statistics show that the most reliable indicator on whether a young person will vote or not how they'll vote, not whether they'll vote Democrat or Republican, but whether they'll vote. The single most reliable indicator is if they come from a home in which at least one parent was a regular voter. Now, in many of the communities that many of you are fortunate enough to come from, that's expected. And your parents and other role models set that example for you. But in a lot of communities, underrepresented communities, economically deprived and challenged communities, it's not a habit. And in many of those homes, there isn't an adult who votes. And so to me, the question is, if a young person doesn't learn the importance of this at home, doesn't learn the importance of it in school, where are they going to learn it? And so for me, ultimately, if you're going to expand the pie, if you're going to get the youngest Californians and the newest Californians to vote, you start early. And you start by not just expanding civics in high school, going down from 12th and 11th to 10th and 9th and even to middle school to 8th and 7th grades, but relating the civics education directly to the volunteer activities that your younger brothers and sisters are already involved in. And so that way, by the time a young man or young woman turns 18 years old, hopefully, they're not thinking of politics as this weird, strange, foreign thing, but rather as a natural extension of the kind of community and volunteer work in which they're already involved. And I think if we can rein in out of control fundraising in politics, I think if we can encourage the youngest Californians and the newest Californians to participate and explain to them that it's their democracy too. And if we can, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later if time permits, do something about the ridiculous hyper-partisanship and hyper-polarization that's paralyzed politics in Sacramento and Washington. Those are the three things I think are the biggest problems with politics. And I think there are solutions to them. And I'm not here today to campaign, but it's those three problems that animated me to run for office. And I hope, regardless of who you vote for, regardless of whether it's me or any of my opponents, that you do vote. And when you prepare to vote, not just for Secretary of State, but for governor and Congress and legislature, look both at those candidates with whom you agree on the substantive issues of the day. Who do you think has a better plan to create well-paying jobs? Who do you think has a better plan to fix a broken system of public education? Who has a more sensible approach to the social and cultural issues that our communities face? But also look for the candidates who are willing to tell you, yeah, you know what? The system's broken. It's not working the way it's supposed to. And yes, I want your help in fixing it. The single most important lesson I learned in all my years of politics, in campaigning, in government, and in teaching this stuff, single most important thing I ever learned is that politics is too important to be left to the politicians. Politics is too important to be left to the politicians, and if they're going to fix it, it's going to take the next generation of leaders, not just to ask for it, but to demand it. And I know a lot of you guys from the last couple of years that I've taught here. Hopefully I'll get a chance to meet more of you this upcoming fall. But the more of you decide that it's worth some of your time and some of your effort to demand a fix and to decide to get involved to help fix a broken system, that's what's going to make change happen. And regardless of what happens in my campaign, I would consider your involvement in that regard to be a huge, huge victory. Thank you very much. Okay. So time for questions, comments, and insults? Is that the plan?
Okay. That order. Before we take questions, why don't you tell them, how many of you actually know what the Secretary of State does?
Okay. For the 98% of you who did not raise your hand, we have a name for you in politics. We call you normal. The Secretary of State is in charge of overseeing the state's elections and voting. The Secretary of State, therefore, is also in charge of campaign fundraising and campaign finance laws. And oddly enough, the Secretary of State is also in charge of issuing licenses for new businesses in California. But the primary responsibility is to make sure that the elections are held in a fair and even-handed way, that everybody who's eligible has access to the polls, and that the votes are counted fairly. And I switched my registration to independent, or as it's now called, no party preference, some years ago, for reasons having nothing to do with this office. But to me, whether it's me or not, the Secretary of State, if they're going to be in charge of the elections, shouldn't be a partisan Democrat or Republican. You don't want the umpire wearing a Giants or a Dodgers jersey. You probably don't want the state's chief elections officer suiting up for the Republicans or Democrats either. And so I do think, whoever it is, me or someone else, the person who's overseeing the elections ought not be playing for one team or the other. That's why I'm running as an independent.
And why don't you tell us one or two things that if you were elected that you would do as Secretary of State?
The question was, for those of you who didn't hear in back, you weren't wearing a microphone, correct?
Sorry, I was not.
Okay, for those of you who didn't hear Alan's follow-up question, first he congratulated me on the brilliance of my presentation. He said I was absolutely fascinating. And he was riveted not just by every word, but every syllable. Alan, I'm flattered, but I'm a little bit embarrassed. I wish he hadn't done that.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
But what's done is done. His question was, what would I do if I got elected? I would give 4 credits rather than 1 for Poli-Sci 179, of course. Okay, for those of you who haven't taken my class, that's called pandering. So I'm just kidding here.
I get 4 times as much money then too, right?
Well, no. Okay. That's called reality. What would I do if elected? I know this is going to come as a huge shock to you guys. I would fight to ban fundraising while the California State Legislature was in session. I would work to expand civics education in our public schools and to expand civics education and leadership training in our underrepresented communities. And I would work as an independent to begin to rebuild the political center in California to reduce some of the hyperpolarization and hyperpartisanship, not because I think moderates are inherently superior to principled progressives or principled conservatives, but because even a principled progressive and a principled conservative need some common ground to come together on which to work. And that ground, that space in between the political 40-yard lines in Sacramento and in Washington is empty, and I want to start repopulating it.
Okay, we'll take some questions from you now. Anything you want to ask Dan? Now's your chance. Thank you.
Yeah. Sure, I didn't talk as much about the third challenge, the hyperpartisanship that I believe is poison politics and keeps us from making the progress we need to on most issues. And the reason I didn't is because I talked too long on the first 2, and I wanted to make sure you guys had time for questions. So thank you for giving me a chance to finish. One of the classes I teach at SC that I don't get to teach here just because I'm only up here for 1 class a year, I teach a class called The Future of California. And in that class, we study the state's 6 most significant policy challenges: job creation and economic growth, K-12 education, healthcare, criminal justice, energy and the environment, and housing and transportation. Are there other critical issues? Of course they are, but 6 is all we can cram into 15 weeks. And what I tell the students at the beginning of the semester, and I alluded to it here a minute ago, is I said, think of politics, whether at the state or national level, think of politics as if it's being played out on a football field. And the problem we have, the challenge we face, is the Democrats set up in one end zone, under one set of goalposts. And the Republicans set up 100 plus yards away in the other end zone on the other set of goalposts. And the question I would ask is, have you ever tried to carry on a careful, nuanced, rational conversation or negotiation with someone who's 100 yards away from you in a crowded stadium? It's not easy. So how do you communicate with somebody who's standing in the other end zone? You scream. You yell. And that's not a productive way of getting policy done. So again, as I was saying a moment ago, to me, running as an independent, in addition to overseeing the elections without an inherent bias toward one party or the other, to me, the other advantage of being, and if I am elected, I would be the first independent elected to statewide office in the history of the state of California. In fact, I'm already the first plausible candidate for statewide office as an independent in the state's history. I begin, if I can break that glass ceiling, that you will see other independents beginning to run for office in 2 years for legislature and for Congress, and 2 years after that for other statewide and constitutional offices. And again, I don't say that to disparage either a principled progressive or a principled conservative, but if you want to get the work done in between the 40-yard lines, you need people standing there, not just in the end zones. If you look back through modern political history, some of the greatest policy achievements that have taken place have come when a president of one party and congressional leaders of the other have come to the realization that they can't get everything they want, which is a reasonable assumption when you're working in a democracy and not a monarchy. But when Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill decided that they could work together, when Bill Clinton and Bob Dole decided that they could work together, really, really impressive things happened. Neither side, neither Republicans or Democrats got everything they wanted, but they were able to make some progress because they were willing to compromise. And for all sorts of reasons that we probably don't have time to get into today, that opportunity for compromise just isn't there anymore. And I think if you elect people to office to repopulate the space in between the 40s, all of a sudden you can begin having those kind of rational conversations again and moving forward on the issues of the day. What issues? Who in here thinks immigration is an important issue? Who in here thinks that there is a rational solution somewhere in between amnesty and self-deportation? You'd never know it from Washington. How many people think that K through 12 education is an important issue here? Actually, I'll ask it another way. How many people here think California's K through 12 public education system works absolutely perfectly? Boy, the hands went down quick. Now, perfect is a big goal, but improvement? I would argue that somewhere between one party that would choke the public schools of the necessary funding they need to accomplish their goals, and another party that would mindlessly pour money into a broken system without thinking about how to spend that money any more effectively. There's common ground in between the 40s. And on jobs, and on housing, and on healthcare, and on environment, you can find that rational ground if you want to. You just need people who are willing to do it. So thanks for giving me a chance to finish my talk. What's your name? Leo, good, well done. You have a question? Yeah. Oh, wow. Totally. Question is, and what's your name? Tom? You had a future in politics. His question was, aren't I concerned that the two political parties would want to crush me if I'm running as an independent? And the answer is, I'm not concerned about it, but it's exactly what they're trying to do. And I understand that. The two parties, Republicans and Democrats alike, they run one of the most effective duopolies in our entire society. Democrats have higher voter registration than Republicans. To me, that means that they're the slightly more successful 8-track tape salesman down at the mall. But 21% of California voters are now registered as independents or no-party preference voters. Almost 30% of your generation of millennials register as independents. More than 40%, even given their registration, identify as independents. Are the parties scared of that? You bet they are. And I have already taken more hits and sharper criticisms and uglier rhetoric than all the other candidates combined. And I can handle it. One, because I sense desperation, and that doesn't bother me at all. In fact, I find it encouraging. If anyone's that scared and that desperate to say those kind of mean things about me, then that means I'm making a difference. And if the worst thing that happens, and Alan mentioned this earlier, for most politicians, losing office and you having to get a real job is a fate worse than death. For me, if the very worst thing that happens is I don't get elected, and the odds are against it. The most likely outcome is the first independent ever to run for statewide office. The most likely outcome is that the day after the primary in June, I'm back at school. The second most likely outcome is that I make it through the primary and the day after the general election in November, I'm back at school. The least likely outcome, although it's getting a little bit better every day, is that I get elected. And if the worst thing that happens is I don't get elected, well, then I go back to USC and I go back to Berkeley, and I get to work with the next generation of California leaders. And that's not so bad. But in the meantime, and whether you play a sport, whether you've been involved in debate, any kind of competition you've ever been involved in, what do you think when you see the other person starting to sweat? You think they're panicking. I got him where I want him. And that's what I think. Great question.
Let's go over here and then we'll come back. Go ahead.
It's another great question. How is it different helping a candidate run as an advisor, as a consultant, or as a staffer, versus running myself? It's weird. For years and years and years, you guys have all seen The Wizard of Oz. I used to say, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, because I want them paying attention to my candidate. And I was the person trying to make things happen without being noticed. So now I'm the person in front. And it's a weird adjustment. Every once in a while, I find myself talking about myself in the third person. And I'm trying to get over that. All kidding aside, the biggest difference, and it's going to sound self-serving, but it's honestly true, political staffers, campaign staffers, and I loved it. And for those of you who haven't worked on a campaign, for those of you who haven't volunteered or interned for a man or woman you believe in, I promise you there is no better feeling in the world than helping someone get elected who you believe is going to make your city or your state or your country a better place to live. And my favorite thing about teaching here and at SC is helping my students get involved for the first time, that first volunteer opportunity, that first internship, that first job after graduation. It's the greatest thing in the world. A campaign staffer spends all their time thinking about how to get to election day. The biggest difference for me as a candidate is I spend a lot more time thinking about what happens after the election. Don't get me wrong. I think about how I'm going to win, and I am going to. But I spend a lot more time thinking about what I will do in office in answer to Ellen's earlier question, whereas for the staffer, the concentration is much more on the campaign. And so thinking about the change that actually happens after the election to me is a really neat place to be. So I think one of the most important lessons you can learn in politics and government, it's just in society, is that election day isn't the end of anything. Election day hasn't accomplished anything. All you've done is elect a donkey or an elephant, red or blue. It doesn't mean anything at all. Election day isn't the end, it's the beginning. And the day after the election is when the man or woman you elected has work to do and needs the help of all the people who voted for him or her. So being able to look over that next horizon to what happens after November, that's the biggest difference, and it's actually kind of cool. First of all, just to clarify, even though the most likely outcome is that I don't win, I will. And I am more than happy either between now and 5 o'clock or afterwards to explain in more detail how that's going to happen. So I will. The odds are against it, but it is going to happen. If it doesn't, will I judge my campaign a success? No, because I set a goal and I haven't achieved it. That said, can good things come out of a contest even if it doesn't turn out the way you wanted? Of course it can. How many of you were in debate, either here or in high school, or mock trial or something like that? Lots of you. How many of you played a sport, either here or in high school? How many of you gained something valuable, maybe not as valuable as winning? How many of you gained something valuable and learned something about yourself and your capabilities when you came up short? Me too. I was the worst swimmer in the history of Wisconsin interscholastic sports. I learned about that a lot. So how would I what would the successes be if I weren't elected? Well, that fundraising ban I talked about. 1 year ago, I could barely get anyone in the Capitol to sit down and talk with me about that fundraising ban. After State Senator Ron Calderon's office was raided by the FBI in the spring, I got some pretty serious meeting with the most powerful people in the Capitol. And after State Senator Leland Yee was arrested for public corruption and arms trafficking a month or so ago. Not only are they taking the meetings, they're taking my idea. And that's good. I don't say that out of any malice whatsoever. My single most challenging opponent, Senator Alex Padilla, is now proposing a fundraising ban during session of his own. It's not a full ban. It's a ban for the last 100 days of session. Personally, I think banning fundraising for half of session is a little bit like quitting smoking Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. It's a nice start. The state Senate President, Darrell Steinberg, and his successor, Kevin DeLeon, have talked about passing a rule rather than a law to ban fundraising during certain parts of their session. It's not far enough. But if the most powerful people in the state capitol are now moving forward on these things, will I consider it a success if I lose? No. But will I think progress has been made if ideas that no one was talking about before I got in the race end up being the law of the land in California? Yeah, that's something I can bring back to campus and feel pretty good about. The question was, why do I think banning fundraising during session is an effective tactic? Well, first I should clarify, I don't think it's a magic answer. There are no magic solutions to a political system that's as broken as ours. But I do think that if you look at what's happened with Senator Yee, with Senator Calderon, and with Senator Rod Wright, in the first 3 months of the calendar year 2014, no fewer than 3 California state senators were arrested, indicted, or convicted on various public charges. And I think what happens is in any culture, in this case the culture of the state capitol, when little transgressions are overlooked, it leads to big transgressions. How many of you have heard of the Broken Windows School of Public Safety? A few of you. The Broken Windows School of Public Safety was pioneered by then New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton back in the 1990s. And what he did is he believed that if you cleaned up graffiti, if you got the squeegee guys off the street, if you cleaned up litter, there would be less violent crime because the community, the culture, would seem less tolerant of people stepping over the line. Little transgressions lead to big transgressions. And so I believe that if you send a message to state legislators saying, look, raise all the money you want, but not on my dime, first do the job you were elected to do, and then when you're doing the job I elected you to do for the year, then go raise money for your next campaign, I think it's an ongoing reminder to them that they do need to be accountable to elected officials, to the people who sent them to Sacramento. I think even the most meticulous record keeper, for even the most meticulous record keeper, if I write you a really big check 6 months before a key vote, it simply can't have the same visceral or emotional impact as if I write you that check right before you go in to vote. And I think if nothing else, if every breakfast, lunch, and dinner is a fundraiser, at the very least, let's give our elected officials back 5 or 6 hours every day to do the job we elected them to do. No magic solution, but definitely progress. I like that. Great question. Would I want to change voting from a Tuesday, say, to a weekend so more people could do it? And the answer is no, but I'll tell you what I would do. I would expand voting. So I wouldn't get rid of Tuesday voting, but I would expand days and hours that voting is available. I'd make it much easier to vote absentee. One thing they do in other states, I'll give you an example. In other states, you can download your absentee ballot online. You can't vote online. I think anyone who shops at Target or Neiman Marcus would probably know why that's not such a good idea. In other states, you can download the absentee ballot online. In some states, you can even fill out that ballot online before you mail it back in. And I think if you expand voting days, if you expand voting hours, if you make voting easier and more accessible, not just for everyday Californians, but you can make changes to make it easier for the disabled to vote. You can make changes to make it easier for Californians for whom English is not their first language to vote. You can make it more convenient in all sorts of ways. But to me, convenience is only part of the answer. You can make something as convenient as you want, but you also got to address the motivation side also. And I don't care how easy I make it to vote. If you don't want to, if you don't think it's going to make a difference, you're still not going to. But I'm glad you asked the question because you really got to do both.
All right, thank you to Dan for coming out. A lot of you have questions. Come on up and meet Dan.